At 100 years old, Dick Van Dyke is more than just a Hollywood legend. He is a living chronicle of entertainment history. But reaching a century of life comes with a heavy price. Saying goodbye to the people who walked that long road beside him. Join us as we look into the 6 celebrity deaths that affected Dick Van Dyke most. A 100 red years of Van Dyke before he was a world-famous star. Dick Van Dyke was just a young boy growing up in the Midwest. He was born in 1925 in West Plains, Missouri, but he spent most of his childhood in Danville, Illinois. His family was not wealthy and life was quite simple. Even as a child, Dick had a very high level of energy. He loved to move, run, and make people laugh. One of the most interesting things about his early life is that he did not originally plan to be an actor. During high school, he actually considered becoming a minister because he was very active in his church and liked talking to people. However, he also joined the drama club and discovered that he had a natural talent for being on stage. When World War II started, he joined the United States Army Air Forces. Even while he was in the military, he found ways to entertain his fellow soldiers by participating in variety shows and working as a radio announcer. This experience helped him realize that he wanted to pursue a career in entertainment. Once the war was over. After the war, Dick started working in radio and then moved into television. In the early days of TV, things were very different than they are now. Many shows were local and performers had to do a bit of everything. Dick started out in a comedy duo called the Merry Mutes with a friend named Phil Erickson. They traveled around and performed pantomime, which is a type of acting where you use your body and face to tell a story without speaking. This is where Dick perfected his physical comedy skills, like his famous rubber legs and his ability to fall down without getting hurt. In the late 1950s, Dick moved to New York City to try his luck on Broadway. This was a huge turning point for him. He got a part in a musical called Bye Bye Birdie. Even though he wasn't a trained dancer, he was so naturally talented and coordinated that he won a Tony Award for his performance. People in Hollywood began to take notice. They saw a man who was tall and thin and could sing, dance, and act all at the same time. This led to the creation of the Dick Van Dyke Show in 1961. This show made him a superstar. Families all over the country would sit down together to watch him play Rob Patry, a funny television writer who always seemed to be tripping over an ottoman in his living room. Once the Dick Van Dyke Show became a hit, Dick moved into the world of movies that he starred in films that are now considered some of the greatest of all time. Most people know him best as both the chimney sweep in Mary Poppins, where he danced with animated penguins and sang about being happy. He also starred in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, a movie about a magical flying car. These roles made him a hero to children all over the world. He had a way of making every character feel like a friend, and his smile became one of the most recognizable things in Hollywood. As he got older, Dick did not slow down. In the 1990s, he started a whole new chapter of his career with a show called Diagnosis, Murder. In this series, he played a doctor who solved crimes. It was a big change from his earlier comedy roles, but audiences loved it. The show ran for 8 years, proving that Dick could stay popular with different generations of viewers. He even continued to make appearances in movies like Night at the Museum and returned for a special dance number in the new Mary Poppins Returns when he was in his 90s. Now that we know how Dick became Astor, let's look at the first person on his list of friends who shaped his journey. Mary Tyler Moore. When the creators of the Dick Van Dyke Show were looking for someone to play the wife of Rob Patry, they were having a very hard time. They had already looked at 60 different actresses. Dick Van Dyke was already cast, but the show needed a woman who could be funny, beautiful, and keep up with Dick's fast-paced physical comedy. Sheldon Leonard, the executive producer, was starting to get worried. Then a 23-year-old girl named Mary Tyler Moore walked into the room. At the time, she was mostly known for being a happy hot punk dancer in commercials where she played an elf. When she read the lines, she had a very unique way of talking. She had a gulp in her voice that made her sound nervous but charming. Sheldon Leonard actually grabbed her head with his hand and told her that he found her. Dick Van Dyke was charmed immediately, even though there was an 11-year age gap between them. They fit together like two pieces of a puzzle. Dick noticed right away that she didn't just stand there and look pretty. She understood the timing of a joke just as well as he did. She won the part, and the two of them began a partnership that would change television history. As the show filmed, the characters of Rob and Laura Pitra became iconic. People across America thought they were a real married couple because their connection was so natural. This wasn't just acting. Dick and Mara became incredibly close friends. They spent almost every day together for years. One of the big reasons they got along so well was their shared background in dance. Both of them lived to move. They didn't need to talk much to understand a dance routine or a physical gag. They could just look at each other and know exactly when to rip, when to jump, or when to slide across the floor. This shared language made their comedy look effortless. They weren't just two actors reading lines. They were a team that moved in total sync. Dick has openly admitted that he had a bit of a crush on Mary during those years. He found her talented and very special. However, their relationship remained a deep, respectful friendship. Behind the scenes, the 1960s were not always easy for them. They both faced personal struggles and the pressures of being famous. They became each other's support system on the set. If one was having a bad day or feeling stressed, the other was there to offer a kind word or joke to lighten the mood. They truly felt like a family. And that warmth radiated through the TV screen into millions of homes. Mary Tyler Moore lived with type 1 diabetes for most of her life. She was very brave about it, but as she got older, the disease caused many health problems. She began to lose her eyesight and struggled with other complications. In January 2017, Mara passed away at the age of 80. For Dick Van Dyke, the news was devastating. Even though they hadn't worked together every day for a long time, they had stayed in touch and performed in specials together over the years. He felt like he had lost a real member of his family. He often referred to her as his work wife. And losing her meant a huge part of his own life story was now gone. At her private memorial service, Dick stood up to give a eulogy. He didn't just talk about her fame or her beauty. He spoke about her talent and her grit. He told the people there that Mary was the engine of their show. He explained that while he got a lot of the laughs, Mary was the one who held everything together with her timing and her heart. He was deeply moved as he remembered their time dancing on the sound stage. To Dick, Mary wasn't just a co star. She was the person who helped him become the legend he is today. Even at 100 years old, he still speaks of her with a sparkle in his eye and a bit of sadness in his voice, proving that their bond was something that time could never erase. Next, let's look at the man who actually created the show and became Dick's closest brother in comedy, Carl Reiner. Carl Reiner. In 1960, Carl Reiner had a script for a show called Head of the Family. He had actually written the lead role for himself. However, when the pilot episode was filmed with Carl in the main role, it didn't quite work the way the producers wanted. They liked the writing, but they felt they needed a different kind of factor for the lead character. This is when Carl met Dick Van Dyke. Carl was a very successful writer and actor, but he was also very humble. Instead of being upset that he wasn't the star, he looked at Dick and realized that Dick had a special kind of energy. Carl decided to step back and become the creator and writer while letting Dick take the spotlight. This was a huge moment because it showed that Carl cared more about making a great show than being the center of attention. He became the architect of Dick's success, building the world of the Dick Van Dyke Show, specifically around Dick's talents. Once they started working together, a bond formed that lasted for 60 years. Their friendship was interesting because they came from different backgrounds. Carl was a master of Jewish-style comedy, which involves a lot of quick wit and wordplay. Dick was a master of slapstick, which is comedy involving physical movement and funny falls. Together they created a style that everyone loved. As the decades went by, they stayed best friends. They lived near each other and developed a very consistent routine. This became known as game night years. Almost every single night, Dick would go over to Carl's house in Beverly Hills. They would eat dinner together, and then sit in the living room to watch movies or television. They spent hours talking about comedy, their families, and the world. Carl often said that Dick was his muse. This means that when Carl sat down to write something funny, he would think about Dick's face and how Dick would say the lines. Dick inspired Carl to be his most creative self. They weren't just colleagues. They were like brothers who chose to spend nearly every evening together for over half a century. In June 2020, Carl Rayner passed away at the age of 98. Toward the end, Dick was still visiting him at his home. Even when Carl was very old and getting weaker, they still enjoyed those quiet moments together in the same house where they had shared thousands of meals. Losing Carl was a massive blow to Dick. When you have a best friend for 60 years, that person becomes a part of who you are. After Carl died, Dick made a public statement that touched many people. He said that the world felt much quieter without Carl's laughter. It didn't just mean that a person had died, that he meant that a specific kind of joy had left the world. Dick felt the silence in his own life, too. The nightly dinners and the movie marathons were over. For Dick, Carl wasn't just a boss or writer. He was the person who understood him better than almost anyone else. Even now, Dick looks back on those 60 years as the most important partnership of his life. Up next, we will look at how Dick's bond with Carl extended to the next generation, including Rob Rayner and his wife, Michelle. Rob and Michelle Rayner. Dick Van Dyke's relationship with Rob Rayner started long before Rob was a famous director. Because Dick and Carl Rayner were working together every single day on the Dick Van Dyke show, their families became naturally intertwined. Rob was just a young boy when the show began, and he spent a lot of time running around the television studio. Dick got to watch Rob grow up from a child into a young man. Because Dick and Carl were like brothers, Dick naturally stepped into a role that felt like a second father to Rob. He was just his dad's friend. He was a constant presence in Rob's life. They shared countless holidays, birthdays, and casual weekends. For Rob, seeing Dick was as normal as seeing any other family member. Dick took great pride in watching Rob's early interests in acting and storytelling begin to bloom on the very stage where they filmed their classic sitcom. As the years passed, the dynamic between Dick and Rob changed in a beautiful way. Rob Rayner eventually became a massive star in his own right, first as an actor on All in